The gunshot echoed through the valley like the crack of doom, a sound that made Mason Irwin's blood run cold as he reined in his stallion at the edge of the ravine. In Clearwater Creek, Montana, a bullet wasn't just lead and powder, it was 20 years of hatred compressed into a single deadly moment. The year was 1878, and the feud between the Irwins and the Norths stretched back to the days when this territory was still wild and untamed. Mason, now 26, had been raised on stories of Edward North's treachery, how the man had stolen Irwin water rights, cattle, and eventually the life of Mason's uncle during the drought of '58. "Damn you, North," Mason muttered, scanning the horizon. He'd been tracking rustlers who'd taken 3 of his best breeding cattle, and the trail led straight to North property. The setting sun painted the Montana sky in fiery oranges and reds, a fitting backdrop to the anger simmering in Mason's veins. He adjusted his worn Stetson and guided his horse down the slope. Law was scarce in these parts, and justice often came from the barrel of a gun rather than a courtroom. His father would expect him to retrieve what was theirs, by force if necessary. As Mason approached the tree line that marked the disputed boundary, movement caught his eye. He slid from his saddle, drew his Winchester, and crept forward. Through the branches, he could make out a figure by the creek's slender, definitely not old Edward North or any of his ranch hands. It was a woman, kneeling at the water's edge. Her chestnut hair caught the dying sunlight, falling in waves down her back as she filled a canteen. Something about her posture, proud yet vulnerable, made Mason lower his rifle slightly. She must have sensed him, for she suddenly went still, then slowly turned her head. Their eyes met across 20 yards of contested ground, hers a startling blue-green that reminded Mason of the mountain lakes high in the Rockies. "I can hear you breathing," she called out, her voice steady despite the rifle now cradled in her arms. "Step out where I can see you properly." Mason hesitated, then emerged from the tree line, keeping his Winchester pointed at the ground but ready. "You're trespassing, Cowboy," she said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Her dress was simple but well made, practical for ranch life. "That's a matter of opinion, madam," Mason replied. "This land belonged to Irwins before your father decided to move his fences in the night." Her eyes widened slightly, and Mason realized his mistake. He'd revealed he knew who she was, Eleanor North, the daughter of his family's most hated enemy. He'd seen her from a distance over the years, but never this close. "So you're one of James Irwin's boys," she said, her grip tightening on her rifle. "Come to shoot at shadows again." "I'm tracking stolen cattle," Mason said flatly. 3 heifers, all bearing the Irwin brand, and their trail leads directly to North property. Eleanor's chin lifted defiantly. "We don't steal cattle, Mr. Irwin. Unlike some, we build our herd honestly. The tracks tell a different story. Tracks can lie. Men can follow false trails, not this man." They stood in tense silence, the burble of the creek the only sound between them. Mason took a moment to truly look at her, perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with a face that would turn heads in any saloon from Montana to Texas. But it was the intelligence in her eyes that caught him off guard. This wasn't just Edward North's pretty daughter. There was steel in her. "I'll tell you what," Eleanor finally said. "I'll help you look for your cattle. If they're on North land, I'll personally see them returned. If they're not, you ride back to your father and tell him to stop throwing accusations." Mason hesitated. 20 years of feuding said to trust her about as much as a rattlesnake, but something in her direct gaze challenged him. "Fine," he agreed, "but I keep my gun." "I wouldn't expect otherwise," she replied, slinging her own rifle over her shoulder. "My horse is just beyond those cottonwoods. We'll start at the south pasture." As they rode side by side, An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Mason found himself stealing glances at her profile, the way she sat her horse with the ease of someone born to the saddle. "Why would you help me?" he finally asked. "Your father would sooner shoot me than share water with an Irwin." Eleanor gave him a measuring look. "Because I'm tired of finding dead cattle with Irwin bullets in them. I'm tired of riding fence line at dawn to check for cut wires. I'm tired of 20 years of hate that started before I was even born." Mason was taken aback by her frankness. "The feud didn't start with the Irwins, nor with the Norths, if you believe my father," she countered. "But someone has to be the first to question whether it's worth continuing." The south pasture opened before them. A sweeping expanse of grass turned golden in the waning light. Mason scanned for his missing cattle but saw only north steers grazing peacefully. "We'll check the eastern field," Eleanor suggested. "Sometimes strays find a way through the fence there." As they rode, Mason found himself watching Eleanor more than the landscape. There was something in her manner that didn't match the picture his father had painted of the scheming Norths. She was direct, practical, and despite everything, fair. The eastern field yielded nothing, nor did the small canyon beyond it. As darkness began to fall, Mason's frustration mounted. "There's one more place to check," Eleanor said hesitantly. "There's an old line cabin near the ridge. My father's oldest hand, Silas, has been staying there. He's set in his ways." Mason caught her meaning immediately. "You think this Silas might have taken it upon himself to rustle Irwin cattle?" Eleanor's expression remained neutral. "I'm saying we should check every possibility." The ridge loomed dark against the twilight sky as they approached the dilapidated cabin. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, and a lantern glowed in the single window. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm. "Let me do the talking," Eleanor whispered as they dismounted. Before they reached the door, it swung open. Silas Moore was a weathered man of perhaps 60, with a beard streaked with gray and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. "Miss Eleanor," he acknowledged, then his gaze hardened when it landed on Mason. "You brought an Irwin to my door." "We're looking for missing cattle, Silas," Eleanor said calmly. 3 Irwin heifers gone missing yesterday." The old man's expression gave nothing away, but Mason noticed how his hand hovered near the revolver at his hip. "Ain't seen no Irwin stock," Silas growled, "and wouldn't keep it if I did. Irwin beef's too tough to eat anyway." Mason took a step forward. "Mind if we check your corral out back then?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "I mind plenty." "Silas," Eleanor said, her voice taking on an edge of authority that surprised Mason, "if you have nothing to hide, there's no harm in looking." For a moment, Mason thought the old man might refuse, but with a muttered curse, Silas stepped aside. "Look all you want. Won't find nothing but North cattle here." Mason followed Eleanor around the cabin to a small corral. In the deepening darkness, he could make out the shapes of cattle. Drawing his match safe from his pocket, he struck a match and held it close to examine the nearest animal. The flare of light revealed what he'd suspected his father's brand, crudely altered to resemble the North mark. He moved to the next animal, and the next. All 3 were his missing heifers. "Eleanor," he called, his voice tight, "these are my cattle." She joined him, examining the brand herself. Her face, illuminated by the match's glow, registered shock, then anger. "Silas," she called out. The old ranch hand appeared at the corner of the cabin, his expression defiant. "They're just cows, Miss Eleanor, and they're drinking North water, eating North grass." "They're stolen property," she said firmly, "and you've altered the brands. That's a hanging offense." "Your father wouldn't say so," Silas retorted. "He's told me plenty of times that anything we take from the Irwins is just getting back what's ours." Mason's anger flared. "That's a convenient way to justify theft." It's not theft when you're taking back what was stolen first, Silas snapped. His hand moved to his gun and Mason tensed. Stop it, both of you, Eleanor stepped between them. Silas, what you've done is wrong, no matter what grievance you think justifies it. These cattle are going back to the Irwin ranch tonight. The old man's face contorted with rage. You'd side with an Irwin against your own blood. After what they did to your uncle, to our water rights. Have you forgotten who they are? I haven't forgotten anything, Eleanor replied steadily, but I won't be party to rustling. Silas's hand fell to his revolver. Your father will hear about this betrayal. In one fluid motion, Mason drew his own weapon, cocking it with a decisive click. Your hand moves another inch toward that gun, and Miss North will be explaining a dead body to her father instead. Time seemed to freeze as the three of them stood in tableau, Silas with his fingers inches from his holster, Mason with his revolver leveled, and Eleanor caught between two generations of hate. Silas, please, Eleanor finally said, her voice soft but firm. It's not worth dying over 3 cows. Something in her tone reached the old man. Slowly, he moved his hand away from his gun. Your father won't stand for this, he warned. I'll deal with my father, Eleanor replied. Now help us get these cattle rounded up. Under Mason's watchful eye, Silas reluctantly helped them herd the 3 heifers out of the corral. Once the animals were secured, Eleanor turned to the old ranch hand. Go back inside, Silas. I'll speak with my father about this tomorrow. The old man gave Mason one last venomous look before retreating to his cabin. When the door slammed shut behind him, Mason turned to Eleanor with newfound respect. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. You could have looked the other way. Eleanor shook her head. And continue 20 years of the same. Someone has to be willing to acknowledge wrong when they see it, regardless of which side did it. As they began the slow process of driving the cattle back toward Irwin land, the night settled around them. Stars appeared overhead, brilliant in the clear Montana sky. Mason found himself studying Eleanor's profile in the starlight, wondering how the daughter of Edward North had grown into a woman with such a clear sense of justice. Your father won't be pleased, Mason observed as they crossed back over the disputed boundary. Eleanor's laugh was soft and without humor. That's putting it mildly. He still tells stories about your father as though James Irwin is the devil himself. And my father does the same about Edward North, Mason admitted. They've hated each other so long I don't think either remembers why it started. A water dispute during the drought, Eleanor supplied. Then cattle theft accusations. Then my Uncle Matthew was shot. By my Uncle Thomas, who was found dead the next day, Mason finished. And on it went. They fell silent, the weight of their family's history pressing down between them. When they reached the main trail that would take Mason home, they stopped. I can manage from here, Mason said, gathering the lead rope for the recovered cattle. You should head back before your father sends men looking for you. Eleanor nodded but made no move to leave. Mason, she said, using his first name for the first time, what if this doesn't have to continue? What if we could end it? The question hung in the night air, impossible and yet compelling. Looking at her in the moonlight, Mason felt something shift inside him, a certainty that had been planted years ago beginning to crack. I don't see how, he answered honestly. There's too much blood between our families. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but there's more to life than old hatreds. She hesitated, then added, I ride by Willow Creek most mornings, if you ever want to continue this conversation. Before Mason could respond, she wheeled her horse around and galloped into the darkness, leaving him with his recovered cattle and a mind full of questions he'd never thought to ask. Morning brought no clarity. Mason delivered the cattle back to the Irwin ranch, but said nothing to his father about Eleanor's role in their recovery. He claimed to have found them wandering near the border, a half-truth that sat uncomfortably in his gut. James Irwin, a hard man made harder by years of conflict, accepted the explanation without question. North probably realized we'd be coming for them and turned them loose, he surmised, stroking his gray-streaked beard. Coward's way out. Mason nodded noncommittally and escaped to the barn, where the day's chores awaited. But as he worked, Eleanor's words kept returning to him. What if this doesn't have to continue? 3 days passed before Mason found himself riding toward Willow Creek, telling himself he was just checking fence lines. The morning was crisp, with the promise of summer heat to come. As he topped the small rise overlooking the creek, he saw her already there, her horse grazing nearby as she sat on a fallen log with a book in her hands. She looked up at his approach, not surprised, as though she'd been expecting him all along. "I thought you might come," Eleanor said, closing her book. Mason dismounted, letting his horse drink from the creek. "I told myself I was just riding fence." A smile touched her lips. "Of course, and I'm just enjoying the morning air with a book." Despite himself, Mason smiled back. "What are you reading?" She held up the volume Walden by Henry David Thoreau. "Have you read it?" Mason shook his head. "Not much time for reading when there's a ranch to run." "That's a shame," she said. Thoreau has some interesting things to say about living deliberately, about choosing one's own path rather than following what's expected. "Sounds dangerous," Mason remarked, settling on the log beside her, maintaining a proper distance. Eleanor laughed, a sound as clear as the creek water. "Perhaps it is, especially in a place where everyone's path seems carved in stone before they're born, like being born an Irwin or a North." "Exactly." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the burble of the creek and the occasional call of birds. "My father was furious about Silas," Eleanor finally said. "He fired him." Mason looked at her in surprise. "Because he stole cattle?" "No," Eleanor replied with a wry smile. "Because he got caught, and because I confronted my father about it. I told him that if he condoned rustling, he was no better than he claimed the Irwins to be. That couldn't have gone well." "It didn't. He said I was naive, that I didn't understand what the Irwins had done to our family." She turned to face Mason fully. "But he wouldn't tell me what started it all. Not really. Just the same old stories about water rights and betrayal." Mason nodded slowly. "My father's the same. All I know for certain is that both sides have lost people, cattle, and land, and neither seems willing to stop." "So it falls to us," Eleanor said simply. "Us, the next generation. We can choose to continue this feud until one family or the other is destroyed, or we can choose a different path." Mason studied her face, earnest, determined, beautiful in the morning light. Something stirred in him that had nothing to do with family loyalty and everything to do with the woman before him. "It won't be easy," he warned. 20 years of hate doesn't disappear overnight." "Nothing worth doing is easy," she countered. "But it has to start somewhere, with someone." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. Through the trees, Mason spotted 3 riders wearing the North brand. Eleanor stood quickly. "My father must have followed me," she said urgently. "Mason, you should go now." But it was too late. The riders had spotted them and were galloping toward the creek. Mason recognized Edward North immediately, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face set in permanent lines of displeasure. With him were 2 ranch hands, both armed. "Eleanor," North called out, his voice thunderous. "Step away from that man." Mason rose slowly, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Eleanor moved between him and her father, a living shield that made Mason's heart clench with fear for her. "Father, this isn't what you think," she began. Edward North reined in his horse so hard the animal reared slightly. "Isn't it? My daughter consorting with James Irwin's son. Have you lost your mind, girl? We were talking, father, just talking." North's eyes narrowed as he looked past her to Mason. Irwin men don't just talk to North women, they scheme and plot and steal what isn't theirs. Mason felt his temper rising. "Sir, I assure you, I don't want your assurances, boy," North spat. "I want you off my land and away from my daughter." "This isn't North land," Mason pointed out, gesturing to the creek. "This is the boundary. I'm exactly where I have every right to be." North's face reddened. "Eleanor, come here, now." Eleanor didn't move. "Father, Mason helped me recover cattle that Silas stole." He could have reported it to the sheriff, but he didn't. This revelation seemed to further enrage North rather than calm him. "So you're admitting you helped an Irwin against your own family, against a man who served the North Ranch for 15 years. "I helped what was right against what was wrong," Eleanor said firmly, "just as you taught me." One of the ranch hands, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. "Want us to escort the Irwin boy off, boss? We can make sure he gets the message." North hesitated, glancing between his daughter and Mason. "No," he finally said. "Eleanor, mount up. We're going home, and you," he pointed at Mason, "stay away from my daughter. The next time I find you near her, I won't be so reasonable." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, but she knew better than to argue further in front of the ranch hands. She turned to Mason, her eyes conveying what she couldn't say aloud. "Good day, Mr. Irwin," she said formally. "Thank you again for your assistance with our cattle issue." Mason nodded, maintaining the pretense. "Miss North." He watched as she mounted her horse and rode away with her father and his men, her back straight and proud despite the tension evident in every line of her body. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Eleanor's face, hearing her voice. The idea she had planted that they could somehow end the feud seemed simultaneously impossible, and the only thing worth pursuing. Dawn found him in the stables, saddling his horse for early rounds. His father appeared in the doorway, watching with knowing eyes. "You're up early," James Irwin observed. Mason nodded, tightening the cinch. "Thought I'd check the north fence line before it gets too hot." "The north fence?" James's voice was flat. "Near Willow Creek, perhaps?" Mason's hand stilled on the saddle. "You've been having me check those fences all spring." "Yes, but not quite so eagerly." James stepped into the stable, his limp from an old gunshot wound more pronounced in the mornings. "Tom Bradley rode in last night. Says he saw you talking with Edward North's daughter 3 days ago. Says North himself rode up with men." Mason turned to face his father. At 48, James Irwin was still a formidable man, broad-shouldered, his dark hair now liberally streaked with silver, his face weathered by sun and hardship. "It wasn't a planned meeting," Mason said, opting for honesty. "I was checking fences. She was reading by the creek. Raiding." James's voice dripped skepticism. "And you just happened to stop for a friendly chat with a North." "She's not just a North," Mason found himself saying. "She's a Leaner, and she's the one who helped me recover those stolen heifers last week." James's eyes narrowed. "You didn't mention that part." "Because I knew how you'd react, just like you're reacting now." "And how am I reacting, son?" "Like anything associated with the North name is poison." James took a step closer, his voice lowering. "That's because it is. Have you forgotten your Uncle Thomas? Found with a North bullet in his back." "I haven't forgotten," Mason insisted. "But Eleanor wasn't even born when that happened. Neither was I." "It doesn't matter. North blood is North blood. So we just keep killing and hating until there's no one left," Mason challenged. "Is that the legacy you want?" James's face hardened. What I want is a son who remembers where his loyalties lie. The Norths have been trying to push us off this land since before you were born. They poisoned our well in 62. They rustled half our herd in 65. They've never dealt fairly with an Irwin, and they never will. Eleanor is different, Mason insisted. She stood up to her father. She made him fire Silas for stealing our cattle. James shook his head in disbelief. And you believe that? Boy, don't you see? This could be just another North trick. Get close to you, win your trust, then strike when we're vulnerable. The accusation made Mason's blood boil. You haven't even met her. You're judging her based on nothing but her last name. That name has caused enough grief in this family to last 10 lifetimes, James shot back. I'm warning you, Mason. Stay away from North land and North women. Nothing good will come of it. With that, James turned and limped out of the stable, leaving Mason alone with his thoughts and a decision to make. 2 days passed without Mason riding to Willow Creek. He threw himself into ranch work, driving himself to exhaustion each day in hopes of clearing his mind. But Eleanor's face kept appearing in his thoughts, her voice echoing in his dreams. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrived at the Irwin ranch, a young boy from town, no more than 12, astride a spotted pony. Message for Mason Irwin, the boy announced, holding out a folded paper. Mason took it with a sense of foreboding, slipping the boy a coin for his trouble. He waited until the messenger had departed before unfolding the note. In neat, feminine handwriting it read, Willow Creek, tomorrow at dawn. Important matters to discuss. E.N. Mason tucked the note into his shirt pocket, his heart racing. The smart choice would be to ignore it, to heed his father's warning. But even as he thought it, he knew what his decision would be. Dawn painted the Montana sky in hues of pink and gold as Mason approached Willow Creek the next morning. He'd left before first light, telling no one where he was going. As the creek came into view, he scanned for Eleanor but saw no sign of her. A knees prickled at the back of his neck. Had something happened? Or was his father right? Was this some sort of trap? A twig snapped behind him. Mason whirled, hand dropping to his revolver, only to find Eleanor emerging from the trees, alone and on foot. You came, she said, relief evident in her voice. Your note said it was important. Eleanor glanced nervously over her shoulder. It is. Mason, my father has decided to take matters into his own hands. He's convinced himself that your family is planning something against ours. Planning what? I don't know exactly, but he's been meeting with men from town, men with reputations. Hiring guns, I think, her voice dropped. I heard him say that it was time to end the Irwin problem once and for all. A cold knot formed in Mason's stomach. When? Soon. Days, not weeks. Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes pleading. Mason, you have to warn your father. Get your family to safety. My father won't run, Mason said grimly. And if North is bringing in hired guns, that's just more proof in his mind that the Norths can't be trusted. Then what do we do? Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. I can't stand by and watch more people die over this senseless feud. Mason took her hands in his, a boldness he wouldn't have dared even days before. Come with me to see the sheriff in Clearwater Creek. If we both tell him what's happening, he might be able to intervene. Eleanor hesitated. Sheriff Parker, he's always favored the Norths. My father plays poker with him twice a month. Then we'll go to the federal marshal in Helena, Mason countered. Someone has to listen. Before Eleanor could respond, horses thundered nearby. They turned to see 3 riders approaching fast, not from Northland, but from the direction of the Irwin ranch. Mason recognized his older brother Michael and 2 ranch hands. Mason, Michael called out, his expression dark as he reined in his horse. Step away from her. Mason didn't move. Michael, this isn't what it looks like. Isn't it? Michael dismounted, his hand on his gun. "Looks like my brother is holding hands with a North while her father plots to kill ours." Eleanor gasped. "How did you—" "We caught one of North's new hired hands scouting our property line last night," Michael explained coldly. After some persuasion, he was quite talkative about North's plans. "That's why I'm here," Eleanor said urgently. "To warn Mason. I don't want any more bloodshed." Michael's laugh was harsh. A North concerned about Irwin blood, that would be a first. He turned to Mason. "Father wants you home, now. We're preparing for whatever North is planning." Mason felt torn between two worlds: the loyalty to his family that had been instilled in him since birth, and the growing feelings for the woman beside him. "Michael, listen to me," he began. "This feud has gone on long enough. Eleanor and I think there might be a way to end it without more killing." "She's turned your head, brother," Michael said with disgust. "Can't you see that? While you're making eyes at the enemy's daughter, her father is hiring men to put bullets in ours." "It's not like that," Eleanor protested. "Save it for someone who hasn't grown up knowing exactly what Norths are capable of," Michael snapped. He turned back to Mason. "You coming home willingly, or do we need to insist?" Mason looked at Eleanor, saw the fear and determination in her eyes. He squeezed her hands once before letting go. "I'll come," he told Michael, "but this isn't over." "It will be soon," Michael replied grimly. "One way or another." The ride back to the Irwin ranch was tense and silent. When they arrived, Mason found the place transformed into something resembling a fortress. Ranch hands were stacking hay bales as barricades, checking rifles, moving cattle to the far pastures. James Irwin stood on the porch of the main house, directing the preparations. When he saw Mason, his face darkened. "So Michael found you," he said flatly. "With the North girl, I presume." "Father, she came to warn us," Mason insisted, dismounting. "She doesn't want this fight any more than I do." "And yet her father is bringing in hired guns to start it," James countered. "Funny how that works. She's not her father." James stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Mason could hear. "Son, I understand the appeal of a pretty face and kind words, but this isn't the time for your heart to overrule your head. The Norths are coming for us, and we need every Irwin man ready to defend what's ours." Mason looked around at the preparations for war and felt sick to his stomach. "And after? Even if we win, even if we kill Edward North and all his men, then what? Will it finally be enough?" Something flickered in James's eyes, doubt perhaps, or simply weariness. But it was quickly replaced by resolve. "We'll do what we must to survive. That's all we can do." For the next 2 days, Mason participated in the preparations, but his heart wasn't in it. Every time he checked his rifle or reinforced a barricade, he thought of Eleanor, of the future they might have had in a world without this senseless hatred. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, Mason stood watch by the north fence line. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, offering just enough light to see by. In the distance, he could make out the lights of the North Ranch house. A soft sound caught his attention: footsteps approaching through the grass. Mason raised his rifle, then lowered it immediately when Eleanor stepped into view, her face pale in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered urgently, moving to meet her. "If anyone sees you, I had to come," she interrupted. "Mason, it's happening tomorrow. My father has 10 hired guns plus our ranch hands. They're planning to attack at dawn." Mason's blood ran cold. "How many men total?" 20, maybe more." Eleanor's voice shook. "Mason, I tried to reason with him. I begged him to stop this madness." "But he's convinced that your family is planning to strike first." "We're just defending ourselves," Mason insisted. "Though I won't deny there are men on our side eager for a fight." Eleanor grabbed his arms. "Then we have to stop it, tonight, now." "How?" Both sides are bent on destroying each other. We leave, she said simply. Together, Mason stared at her. What? Think about it, Mason. What's truly keeping this feud alive? The memory of my father and yours, their unwillingness to let go of old grievances. Her eyes shone with intensity. But what if we showed them another way? What if the North daughter and the Irwin son chose each other over this endless cycle of vengeance? You're talking about running away. I'm talking about making a stand for peace instead of war. She took his hands in hers. I've come to care for you, Mason Irwin. More than I should, given who we are. And I hope you feel something for me too. Mason's heart hammered in his chest. This woman, who should have been his enemy, had somehow become the most important person in his world in the span of mere weeks. I do, he admitted. But Eleanor, leaving won't stop tomorrow's bloodshed. It might even make it worse. Not if we go to Helena first, she countered. To the federal marshal. We tell him everything, the escalation, the hired guns, all of it. With both of us speaking against our own families, he'll have to take action. It was a desperate plan, fraught with risks. If they failed, they would be branded traitors by both sides. If they succeeded, well, that was hardly more certain. But looking into Eleanor's determined eyes, Mason knew he couldn't let her face this alone. All right, he agreed. But we need to move fast. Get back to your ranch, pack only what you absolutely need. I'll meet you at Willow Creek in 2 hours. Eleanor's relief was palpable. She squeezed his hands, then, in a moment of boldness, stood on her tiptoes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. 2 hours, she confirmed, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. Mason hurried back to the ranch house, his mind racing. He would need supplies, money, his best horse. And he would need to leave a letter for his father, an explanation, not an apology. The house was quiet as he slipped inside. Most of the men were resting before what they believed would be a battle at dawn. Mason quickly packed his saddlebags with essentials, strapped on his gun belt, and sat down at the small desk in his room to write the hardest letter of his life. He had just finished when a floorboard creaked behind him. Mason turned to find his father standing in the doorway, a lantern in hand casting long shadows across the room. "Going somewhere, son?" James asked quietly, his eyes taking in the packed saddlebags and the letter on the desk. Mason stood, facing his father squarely. "Yes, with her. With Eleanor North." There was no point in denying it. "We're going to Helena, to the federal marshal, to stop this before more people die." James's face betrayed no emotion, but his knuckles whitened around the lantern handle. "So you're choosing her over your own blood?" "I'm choosing life over death," Mason corrected. "An end to this feud over its continuation." "You think it's that simple?" James set the lantern down on a side table, his movements deliberate. "That you and Edward North's daughter can ride off into the sunrise and magically heal 20 years of wrongs?" "No," Mason admitted. "But it's a start. Someone has to be the first to put down their gun." James was silent for a long moment, studying his son as if seeing him for the first time. "You love her," he finally said. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded. "I do, though I've hardly had time to tell her so." Another long silence. Then, unexpectedly, James sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Your mother would have liked you for this, you know. She always said the feud would be the death of us all." The mention of his mother, who had died when Mason was 12, caught him off guard. "You never told me that." "There's a lot I never told you," James acknowledged. "Like how Edward North and I were friends once, before the drought of '58 turned us against each other." "Friends?" Mason was stunned. "Came west together from Pennsylvania, built our first cabin side by side." James shook his head as if marveling at a distant memory. "But that was a lifetime ago." Mason took a step toward his father. "Then why continue this, if you were friends once, Because too much has happened since, James cut in, his voice hardening again. Too much blood spilled. Some things can't be forgiven, Mason. Can't or won't. Mason challenged. Before James could answer, shouts erupted from outside. Then a gunshot, followed by more. James grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Sounds like North decided dawn was too long to wait, he said grimly, checking the weapon. You still planning to run, son? Mason hesitated, torn between his plan with Eleanor and the immediate threat to his family. I can't let you face this alone. That's what I thought. James handed Mason his own rifle. Come on, we've got a ranch to defend. Outside was chaos. Riders were approaching from the north, firing as they came. The Irwin men had taken defensive positions behind hay bales and outbuildings, returning fire. In the darkness, it was hard to tell how many attackers there were, but the gunfire was constant. Mason took position beside Michael behind an overturned wagon. I thought North wasn't moving until dawn, he shouted over the gunfire. Guess he wanted the element of surprise, Michael replied, sighting down his rifle and firing at a shadowy figure. Mason scanned the attackers, dread filling him as he searched for any sign of Eleanor. Had she been caught? Or worse, was she part of this night attack despite her promises? Mason, you're 3 o'clock, Michael warned. Mason swung his rifle around and fired at a man rushing their position. The attacker fell, but 2 more took his place. This was no mere show of force. The North riders were pressing hard, clearly intending to overrun the ranch. For what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Mason defended alongside his family. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mingling with shouts and the thunder of hooves. Then, through a momentary lull in the gunfire, Mason heard a familiar voice calling his name. He peered over the wagon to see Eleanor riding hard toward the ranch, alone and unarmed, her hair streaming behind her. Hold your fire, Mason shouted to the Irwin men. Hold your fire. But in the confusion, not everyone heard or heeded the command. A shot rang out from somewhere to his right, and Eleanor's horse reared. She clung to its mane, somehow staying mounted as the animal bolted sideways. Mason was on his feet in an instant, racing toward her despite Michael's shouts to take cover. More gunfire erupted around him, but all he could see was Eleanor, vulnerable and exposed in the crossfire. He reached her just as another volley of shots came from the North riders. Without thinking, Mason threw himself against her horse, pulling Eleanor from the saddle as bullets whizzed overhead. They tumbled to the ground together, Mason covering her body with his own as they rolled into the shallow ditch beside the road. "Are you hit?" he demanded, frantically checking her for wounds. "No, I'm all right," she gasped. "Mason, this wasn't supposed to happen. My father doesn't know I'm here. I was coming to meet you when I saw his men already riding out." "So much for our plan," Mason said grimly, keeping low as more bullets struck the ground nearby. "We can still stop this," Eleanor insisted. "If they see us together, maybe a new volley of gunfire cut her off." The battle was intensifying, men shouting and horses screaming in the darkness. Mason knew they couldn't stay in the open. "We need to get to cover," he said. "Stay low and follow me." They crawled through the ditch toward the main house, bullets kicking up dirt around them. When they finally reached the porch steps, Mason pulled Eleanor to her feet and they dashed inside. James Irwin was there, reloading his rifle by lamplight, his face grim with concentration. He looked up in shock when Mason burst in with Eleanor. "What in God's name?" he began. "Father, listen," Mason interrupted. "Eleanor had nothing to do with this attack. She was coming to help me stop it." James's eyes narrowed as he looked at Eleanor. "Is that so, Miss North? Then perhaps you can explain why your father's men are trying to kill mine in the middle of the night." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly despite her disheveled appearance. My father believes you're planning to attack us at dawn. Someone told him your men were gathering for an assault. And who might that someone be? James demanded. I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But whoever it is has been playing both sides against each other. She took a step forward. Mr. Irwin, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I care for your son, and I'm tired of seeing people die for a feud that should have ended years ago. James stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Outside, the gunfire continued unabated. Fine words, he finally said, but they don't stop bullets. No, Eleanor agreed, but this might. She pulled a folded document from her pocket, handling it to James with steady hands. This is the deed to the disputed water rights, signed over to neutral hands specifically, to be held in trust for any children born to the union of an Irwin and a North. James unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read. Your father agreed to this. No, Eleanor admitted. I took it from his safe. He'll be furious when he discovers it's missing. She glanced at Mason. But I was hoping that by the time he does, we'd be in Helena with the federal marshal's protection. James looked between the document and Eleanor, then at his son. Outside, a man's cry of pain pierced the night, followed by renewed gunfire. This doesn't end what's happening right now, James said, refolding the deed. No, Mason agreed, but it might end what happens tomorrow and the day after that. He took Eleanor's hand in his. Father, I'm going out there with Eleanor. If both sides see us together standing between them, they'll shoot you both, James interrupted bluntly. Maybe, Mason acknowledged, or maybe they'll hesitate just long enough to listen. James studied his son's face, then Eleanor's. Whatever he saw there seemed to reach something long buried in him. He sighed heavily, then reached for his coat. Not alone, you're not, he said gruffly. If my son's going to make a target of himself, his father ought to be there too. Eleanor's eyes widened. Mr. Irwin, James, he corrected. If you're willing to risk your life alongside my son, you might as well use my given name. The three of them moved to the porch, James signaling to the Irwin men to hold their fire. In the pre-dawn light, the battlefield was becoming more visible, men crouched behind whatever cover they could find, the occasional muzzle flash illuminating grim faces. I need something white, Mason said, looking around. Eleanor quickly untied the cotton scarf from around her neck. Will this do? Mason took it, tying it to the end of a rifle. Stay between us, he told Eleanor. Father ready, James nodded grimly. As I'll ever be. Together they stepped off the porch, Mason holding the makeshift white flag high. Slowly, deliberately, they walked into the open space between the two forces. Hold your fire, Mason shouted, his voice carrying in the sudden lull. North men, hold your fire. For a breathless moment, the gunfire continued. Then, gradually, it tapered off until an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. In that silence, a lone rider emerged from the North line's Edward North himself, his face a mask of fury as he spotted his daughter between the two Irwin men. Eleanor, he called out, urging his horse forward. What is the meaning of this? It means I'm choosing peace over war, Father, Eleanor called back. It means I'm standing with the man I love, even if he is an Irwin. Edward reined in his horse sharply. Love, have you lost your mind, girl? These men have been trying to destroy us for 20 years. And you've been trying to destroy them, Eleanor countered. When does it end, Father? How many more have to die before you're satisfied? Edward's gaze shifted to Mason, then to James. This is your doing, he said to the elder Irwin, his voice cold with hatred. You've turned my daughter against me. No one turned me against you, Eleanor said before James could respond. I made my own choice, just as Mason has made his. Mason stepped forward, still holding the white flag high. "Mr. North, our families have been fighting so long that most of us don't even remember why. All we know is the hate we were taught." He glanced at Eleanor, drawing strength from her presence. "But Eleanor and I have found something stronger than that hate, and we're asking, begging, if necessary, for both sides to lay down their guns and talk." Edward North's face remained hard as stone. "Talk? After your men fired on my daughter?" "That was an accident," Mason said quickly. In the confusion, convenient excuse, Edward spat. "Just as it's convenient that both sides believed the other was planning a dawn attack," James Irwin interjected, stepping forward. "Someone has been playing us against each other, Edward. Stoking the flames of a fire that should have died years ago." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Edward's face. "What are you talking about?" "My men were preparing for defense, not attack," James explained. "We'd heard you were bringing in hired guns to finish us off. And I heard you were massing men at the border, ready to strike," Edward countered, though with less conviction. Eleanor looked between the two aging patriarchs. "Don't you see? Someone wanted this to happen, someone who benefits from our families destroying each other." A tense silence fell as both North and Irwin men began to emerge from their positions, weapons still ready but no longer aimed directly at the opposing side. "The water rights," James said suddenly, understanding dawning. "The railroad's been trying to buy up land along the creek for months. If both our families were gone, they'd have clear access to the water without opposition," Edward finished, the realization shifting his expression from anger to calculation. "That land agent, Phillips, has been meeting with both sides separately," James confirmed, offering to mediate while actually inflaming tensions. Mason watched as the two old enemies began, tentatively, to see the common threat. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a start. "Father," Eleanor said, addressing Edward North, "I have the water rights deed. I've had it modified to be held in trust." Edward's eyes narrowed. "You took that from my safe, for the good of both families," she confirmed. "Read it, please. See what future might be possible." With obvious reluctance, Edward dismounted and approached. James handed him the document, their fingers almost touching in the exchange, the closest they had come to a peaceful interaction in decades. As Edward read, the first rays of dawn broke over the eastern hills, illuminating a battlefield where, miraculously, no one had yet died this day. "A trust," Edward finally said, looking up from the paper, "for children born of an Irwin and a North union." His gaze shifted to his daughter and Mason, understanding dawning. "You two are serious about this?" "We are," Mason confirmed, taking Eleanor's hand in his. "We were planning to leave for Helena this morning to seek the marshal's protection while we tried to end this feud, but perhaps there's another way." James Irwin stepped forward, his face solemn. "Edward, we've spent 20 years trying to destroy each other, and what has it gotten us? Dead brothers, scarred land, children raised on hate," he gestured to Mason and Eleanor. "But these two see something we've forgotten how to see." "And what's that?" Edward asked, his voice gruff but no longer hostile. "A future," James said simply. "One built on something other than vengeance." For a long moment, Edward North stood silent, looking between his daughter, the Irwins, and the paper in his hand. Around them, the men of both sides watched and waited, guns lowered but not forgotten. Finally, Edward looked directly at Mason. "You love my daughter enough to stand between two feuding families?" "Yes, sir," Mason answered without hesitation. "Enough to die for her if necessary, but I'd rather live for her." Edward nodded slowly, then turned to James Irwin. "We have a lot to discuss, you and I. And not all of it will be pleasant." "No," James agreed. "But it's past time we tried." As the sun rose fully over the Montana landscape, illuminating the battlefield that would not claim more lives this day, Mason felt Eleanor's hand tighten in his. They had done what seemed impossible, taken the first step toward ending a feud that had defined both their families for a generation. The days that followed were not easy. Trust, once broken, is not quickly rebuilt. But with Eleanor and Mason standing firm in their commitment to each other and to peace, the process of reconciliation began. The water rights were formally placed in the trust Eleanor had created, with both James Irwin and Edward North as trustees, until such time as an Irwin-North union produced heirs. The railroad land agent, Phillips, was confronted by both families together and admitted to deliberately spreading false information to inflame tensions. 1 month after the confrontation at the Irwin Ranch, Mason and Eleanor were married in Clearwater Creek's small church. The ceremony was attended by both families still awkward with each other, still nursing old wounds, but willing, at last, to try a different path. As Mason slipped a ring onto Eleanor's finger, he looked out at the gathered witnesses, his father and brothers on one side, her father and cousins on the other. Not yet unified, but no longer openly hostile. It was a beginning. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words seemed to carry a special weight in this gathering, a reminder of the choice that had been made: love over hatred, future over past. At the small reception held on neutral ground, the town's gathering hall, James Irwin and Edward North found themselves standing together by the punch bowl, watching as their children danced. "They look happy," Edward observed gruffly. "They do," James agreed. After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I remember when we were that young, coming west with big dreams." Edward nodded slowly. "Simpler times. Before the drought, before Matthew and Thomas," James sighed. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd talked instead of fought back then." "We'll never know," Edward said, "but perhaps they won't have to wonder." He gestured toward Mason and Eleanor, now laughing as they spoke with guests from both families. "Perhaps not," James agreed. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "To their future, then." After a moment's pause, Edward North took the offered hand. To their future. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But as their hands clasped briefly, both men seemed to recognize that while they might never fully reconcile their own past, they could at least allow their children a different future. 2 years passed. The Irwin-North feud, once the defining conflict of Clearwater Creek, gradually faded from daily conversation. Mason and Eleanor built a home on the boundary between the two ranches, a physical symbol of their union and the bridge they continued to build between their families. Spring arrived early in 1881, painting the Montana landscape in vibrant greens and wildflower purples. On a warm April morning, Eleanor gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, healthy and strong-lunged. As Mason held his son while Eleanor cradled their daughter, a knock came at the door of their bedroom. The midwife opened it to reveal both grandfathers, James Irwin and Edward North, standing awkwardly in the hallway. "They're asking to see the babies," the midwife explained. Eleanor smiled, tired but radiant. "Let them in." The two men entered cautiously, their eyes immediately drawn to the infants. 2 years of gradual reconciliation had softened some of the hardness between them, though they would never be close friends. But they had found a way to exist in the same room without reaching for weapons, which was progress of a sort. "A boy and a girl," Mason said proudly. "Both healthy." James approached first, gazing down at his grandson in Mason's arms. "He has the Irwin chin," he observed, a hint of a smile tugging at his weathered face. "And the North eyes, I think," Edward added, looking at the little girl in Eleanor's arms. "What will you call them?" Eleanor and Mason exchanged a glance. They had discussed names extensively, aware of the weight their choices would carry in healing the rift between their families. "Thomas Matthew Irwin," Mason said, naming the boy after the two uncles whose deaths had cemented the feud, "and Sarah Marie Irwin, after both our mothers." A profound silence fell over the room. Both older men stood very still, the significance of the names not lost on either of them. "Thomas Matthew," James repeated softly, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "Your uncle would be proud." "As would yours," Edward said to Eleanor, his voice gruff with emotion as he looked at the infant named partly for his brother. The babies, unaware of the history their names carried, slept peacefully in their parents' arms. In that quiet moment, as the spring sunlight streamed through the windows, Mason met Eleanor's eyes across the room and saw in them what he felt in his own heart: hope, love, and the certainty that they had made the right choice that night 2 years ago, when they had stood together between two warring families and chosen a different path. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched vast and promising beneath an endless blue sky. The boundary line between North and Irwin land still existed on paper, but in reality, it had begun to blur just as the hatred that had defined both families for 20 years was gradually giving way to something new, not forgetting, for the past could never be entirely erased. But forgiveness, perhaps, and more importantly, a future where Thomas Matthew and Sarah Marie Irwin would grow up knowing themselves as bridges rather than barriers, inheritors of reconciliation rather than revenge. As the babies were passed carefully to their grandfather's former enemies, now awkwardly united by these new lives, Mason moved to stand beside Eleanor's bed, taking her hand in his. "We did it," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. Eleanor smiled up at him, squeezing his hand. "We've only just begun," she replied. And in that moment, with their children in the arms of men who had once sought to destroy each other, both knew she was right. They had not merely ended a feud, they had started something new. Something that, like the Montana spring unfolding outside their window, promised growth, renewal, and life after a long, cold winter of hatred. In the years that followed, the story of Mason Irwin and Eleanor North became something of a legend in Clearwater Creek, how they had stood between bullets with nothing but love and determination, how they had chosen each other over 20 years of hatred. It was a story told to children and grandchildren, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal, given time and courage and the willingness to see beyond the scars of the past. And while James Irwin and Edward North never became the friends they had once been in their youth, they found a kind of peace in their shared grandchildren, in watching the next generation grow unburdened by the weight of a feud that had very nearly destroyed them all. For Mason and Eleanor, the choice they had made that fateful dawn never seemed in doubt, despite the challenges they faced in bringing two hostile families together. Each night as they lay beside each other, as their family grew and their love deepened, they knew they had chosen rightly: love over hatred, future over past, life over the long shadow of death that had hung over both their families for 20 long years. In choosing each other, they had not merely ended a feud. They had created a legacy of courage, of hope, and of the profound truth that sometimes the bravest thing two people can do is to stand together against the tide of history and declare, "This ends with us. Here and now, this ends with us. And something new begins."